Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Gerbrandt van Heerden. Gerry, how are you doing?
Hello, Nicholas. I'm cool, calm, and collected.
Very good. And also joining us today is Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi Nick, hi Harry, doing well, thanks. Dealing with our failing state all around us, but hopefully we're all learning good lessons about state proofing. That's what I'm trying to tell myself.
Indeed. Although one of the things that can be a little bit difficult to state-proof yourself against is, in fact, the state of the roads. I guess you can, if you have the money, you can buy yourself a bigger car, but even that's got its limitations. And it looks like we might be having more problems with our road network in the near future. So I think it's probably fair to say, at least in my personal experience of driving around the country, that SANRAL's the National Roads Agency, tends to run its sections of the road network relatively well. They sometimes have problems, sometimes things take too long, but generally speaking, the quality of the sort of national roads, I'm thinking things like the N1 and stuff, are not that bad. A lot of accidents and things, but the quality of the road is pretty good. Well, it looks like SANRAL is about to hit a bit of a problem. What it calls is a fiscal cliff, and that it will no longer be able to expand the roads under its purview, nor fully address the backlog of maintenance required to bring them up to standard. This comes exactly as the national government is trying to expand the amount of road that SANRAL is supposed to look after because of the failings of municipal and provincial governments. So currently, of the South African road network, SANRAL manages about 23,500 kilometers. The provinces are supposed to manage 271,000 kilometers. Metros are responsible for 66,000, and the municipalities 256,000. So that's the whole of SA's road network. However, basically, the national government wants to add 15,000 kilometers of road to SANRAL's portfolio. SANRAL says it doesn't have the necessary financing, budgetary aid from the national fiscus to meet its expanding portfolio, and it simply can't keep up with what needs to be done. And that given its budgetary constraints, it is no longer going to be able to expand any roads anywhere in the country, and that that all of their budget assumptions going forward are taking this in mind. Chris, what do you make of this story? SANRAL, like I said, is one of those parts of the government that tends to work a little bit better, but it's a little bit like, you've got this whole system, and imagine a whole bunch of wooden beams being the road network, and as one gets rotten, they put weight on the other one, and that seems to be what SANRAL is suffering from here.
Yeah, it's interesting and noteworthy from the macro policy point of view how there's this bit of a centralization, a tendency towards centralization or decentralizing more and more things in one, department or one agency. So same thing with the NHI, for example. You want to fix ostensibly issues in public and private care, so you centralize the management of all healthcare in the Department of Health, for example. That doesn't mean you're going to fix the underlying issues. So now again, if you're acknowledging, and rightly so, giving credits where it's due, that the issues with maintenance and funding and provincial and municipal issues with the roads, that doesn't mean that by putting it all on SANRAL's shoulders, even if they've done well with certain things, that it'll then fix those things on the ground, as it were, those very basic issues. Not to say I'm a road engineer, but you would want more of a focus on what are the particular geographical challenges in some municipalities versus others. What is the traffic like? Is it more freight versus, cars, sort of small hatchbacks, that sort of stuff? Looking at those things, how you figure those out. Where do you get your funding from? Is the municipality insolvent, for example? Should it have that sort of support from national government or not? What should be the requirements from national government to ensure that they sort of write their own fiscal issues, as it were? So, I think it's an easy way to look like you're solving things, I think, to say you're taking action, you're intervening, you're going to step in, but that doesn't mean that you capacitate that responsibility and actual reform on the ground. That doesn't mean you get the sort of engineers in place, the right skills, you incentivize those things. So I think it's too easy a cover, as it were, versus acknowledging just how deep the rot possibly has become with the roads. And just a last thought, given the very quick decline of the railways, how much freight there is now on the roads. This is adding even more pressure, of course, onto the state of roads pretty much across the country, of course, more so towards places like Richards Bay. But that's going to make it even more difficult, I think, for an entity like SANRAL to get things right, maybe.
Yeah, it seems here that we've got another example of how the ANC ideological approach is not really fit for purpose here. We've got this network that has some decentralized aspects, right? Because you've got metros, municipalities, the provinces, and the national government all taking care of different sections of road. But because some of the local elements are failing, the ANC is following the same approach it tries to follow with every single problem, which is, well, we just need to centralize more of the activity in some nationally controlled department because that'll fix it. National works better than the provinces. But I'm skeptical. Harry, what do you make of this story?
Yeah, I think what's really concerning about the state of our roads is, the road network is pivotal for our agricultural sector. Lots of farmers rely on our roads to transport their goods to food manufacturers and to big markets. And a survey that was done by Grain SA, I believe, found that farmers spend hundreds of thousands of rands each year to recover equipment, to repair damaged vehicles because of poor road networks, food that gets spoiled because of delays due to bad roads. It's incredibly devastating for one of the most important economic sectors in our country. And so the fact that the roads have been allowed to decay to the extent that they have, and there's absolutely no plan to really fix them, instead of putting more pressure on SANRAL, which is one of the few entities that still have a relatively okay track record. I don't think that's a good way to solve the crisis. And like Chris said, we can't rely on our railway anymore. So roads have become even more pivotal for the transport of everything, and we don't have that anymore.
I think sort of politically and psychologically, there's also the no increase in the roads is important here. So obviously, there will still be road construction around the country, presumably in the provinces and municipalities. But one of the things the ANC could, with some justification, point to as its great success of government is look at, maybe the infrastructure we haven't rolled out isn't the greatest quality. Maybe we haven't, made sure there's enough electricity and stuff, but we've rolled out a lot. There's new roads all over the country. There's toilets all over the country. There's electricity infrastructure all over the country. There's water pipes all over the country. But what's been the story of the last, especially decade, and more than a decade now, almost a decade and a half, is that seems to have come to a halt. And, you can now, if the ANC wants to point at, for example, the multiple lane highway around Johannesburg and say, oh, you see, our government built this, and that's why we should remain in power in Joburg. If SANRAL is going to stop expanding that kind of thing, it really hurts any positive case you can make for an ANC government. Chris, your thoughts on that before we move on?
I think that's very important, and the seeds, as it were, for that, the sort of the decade we've experienced up until now, the seeds for the decline in terms of maintenance investment, those were all sown in what we call Democratic South Africa's first age, so from 94 up until about 2007, 2008, with things like BEE, cadre deployment, increased tendencies towards centralization from the ANC side. All of that stuff has ensured that you just haven't had the investment you need. I mean, just some of that data that SANRAL released in their latest presentation, as you rightly point out, there was investment in roads and rolling out different forms of infrastructure. But now recently, that's all well and good, but about 80% of the paved network is older than the original 20-year design life. So you've got great rollout, but then not the maintenance to keep it going. So where do you ask the question, where are your priorities? Where is that money going to? Is it going to salaries, maybe, for those at the very top of the organizational tree, or the organogram, as it were? So I think it's indicative of good work being now undermined slowly but surely. And it's no longer, I think, a developmental state that we have at the moment. It's more of a predatory state.
All right, let's move on to our next topic. And this is a document that was put out by you guys at the Center for Risk Analysis. Both Chris and Gerbrandt work for the Center for Risk Analysis. And it's titled Macro Review, SA's Education System Missing the Mark. Harry, I believe you're the editor of it. Can you tell us what the findings of the macro review of the South African education system were?
Yes, so the goal of this report was to look at the general state of the education sector in the country. And, there has been some positive findings. In the last 2 decades, enrollment in grade R has increased by around 240%. And this is, pivotal for the development of pupils at an early stage. And enrollment at universities over the last 2 decades have also increased from 15% to around 22%. And so we've got more people entering the education sector. But the other side of that is the outcomes of our schooling system is quite poor. I think many of our clients will be familiar with this chart that we featured in the report, which showed that around 1 million pupils entered grade 1 in 2011. Only 700,000 of them made it to grade 12. Only 600,000 passed their national senior certificates or their matric examinations, and only those passed. Only the 300,000 managed to pass well enough to enter university, and this, added to the fact that the requirements to pass is relatively low. For many subjects at secondary school, you only have to get 40% in order for you to be considered to pass those. And I think, there's all this talk about, South Africa's major inequality trends, growing inequality, and what the government should do to rectify it. And, we've had the social grant system that was implemented. We have some other radical policies to redistribute wealth. But I think the one thing that the government is clearly not paying attention to are the schools. And I think this is like in modern day South Africa, the education system is the number one source of inequality in the country. We only see 22% of matriculants actually getting more than 50% for their maths, and only 30% of matriculants actually get more than 50% for science. And I mean, these are very critical subjects in a modern world, in a modern day South Africa that is seeing its tertiary sector and its ICT sectors growing. There's definitely a skills mismatch. And another thing is that, not everybody can afford going to universities. You have, for example, the technical vocation colleges, the TVETs. But even these perform quite poorly. And what we also saw in a 2019 paper, for example, is that the curricula of TVETs are misaligned with the needs of employers. So there's kind of a mismatch of what the TVETs are producing and what employers actually want. And this forces a lot of companies to do their own in-house training. So they have to apply their own resources and own time to retrain graduates in order to be able to do the jobs that is required of them. So I think to conclude, I'll just say that the education system is I think is the number one obstacle to inequality in this country, and the government is not addressing it at all.
So let me take a sort of devil's advocate, slightly contrarian position here, Chris, which is that, contrary to what Kerry just said, education is definitely nice to have your population, and it's definitely important for sort of personal development or that kind of thing. But that you don't actually need it to be a successful country, especially when you're starting from a kind of relatively low base. And that if you just deregulate the economy and get some of the basics going, that's all you really need. Do we need to put as much focus as we do in our education system? I mean, it is the biggest budget item. And as Kerry said, we're not getting a lot of bang for our buck. So do we really need to spend as much as we do on the education system?
No, I think you raise an important point, and one should ask the question whether in a more globalized world, whether there's opportunities for that government spending to maybe go elsewhere, or to just move where the private sector and private public interventions can take that gap. So you focus maybe, for example, on upskilling in terms of computer literacy, in terms of the skills that people don't just have to work in the geographical place where they're based, but they can work for any company around the world. That could be a particularly strong point, and that could change over time. I mean, something like Chat GPT might change that radically overnight, and you can't wait for bureaucrats to try and solve that. That's going to take them, their various 10-year, 20-year plans, as it were. That being said, if you have the sort of history that South Africa has, and you want some sort of state responsibility or state involvement in giving people some kind of initial leg up, as it were, then make sure that it's very targeted in terms of accountability and transparency. So that spending has to come with requirements around teacher performance, what role the unions play. Of course, the role that they've played up until now has been relatively detrimental, because they've protected those within the industry from real reform, as it were, to the ultimate detriment of children. So ask those questions about where does the funding go and how is it meted out? How is it spent? What is it targeted towards achieving? Because at the moment you say you're spending so much on education, every year you tout the number of matriculants who get who get their matric, but that doesn't mean that they're actually capacitated to partake in an economy. And at this point in time, many of them, millions of them, are being left behind.
Kerry, final thoughts from you before we move on?
Just that, it's clear that South African parents have absolutely no confidence in the public schooling system. We've seen, for example, in the Eastern Cape, the number of pupils that are enrolled in independent schools or private schools in the Eastern Cape increased by around 700%, over 700%. Of course, off a very low base, but I think that just shows that when people actually have the means to do so, they will move away from the state.
All right. Let's move on to our next topic, where there is, of course, one area where it is difficult at the moment to move on from the state. And this is always kind of interesting to me, because South Africa had the apartheid government. It's been rewritten by some on the South African left as being this kind of capitalistic, anti-communist, free market government, but it really wasn't. Anyone who's studied the economic history of apartheid knows that, beyond all the race laws, which of course constrained economic activity enormously, there were enormous numbers of state-owned enterprises and boards which decided things, and you had like a cheese board that says how cheese must be made in the country and things like that. So we still see that legacy, I think, in many aspects of our society, particularly now that a lot of those state-owned enterprises have been run into the ground by sort of gated deployment and other nefarious policies from the ANC government. A latest example of this is the Onderspoort Biological Products state-owned enterprise, which is responsible for producing animal vaccines, which are extremely important in the livestock industry to protect your animals from various diseases. In this case, farmers say that red meat industry is effectively now in a state of disaster due to shortages of important vaccines produced that are only allowed to be produced by the state-owned enterprise. The diseases I think that are most devastating to animals are, in this case, I think something called blue tongue disease, which is affecting sheep, as well as African horse sickness and Rift Valley fever vaccines. And in fact, the problem has gotten so severe that some farmers have resorted to illegally acquiring vaccines, which they are from other sources, which they are not actually allowed to do under the law. The Agricultural Minister, Toko Didiza, has asked Aspen to step in to assist with the manufacture here and basically to get the private human pharmaceutical side of things to get engaged on producing these animal vaccines. Chris, what do you make of this? Interesting here, once again, we see a case of the ANC reluctantly, accidentally sort of privatizing something that it really doesn't want to due to its own failures.
Yeah, contrary to their best, what their rhetoric tells them about what they aim to achieve about transforming society into this vision that they have as the vanguard of the revolution and the national democratic ideal. In actual practice, maybe nothing has been better for state-proofing South Africans than the policies and ideology of the ANC. So very much going against what they would have wanted to achieve in the first place. It's obviously a very unfortunate and difficult situation already with people in agriculture generally, farmers across the value chains being under so much pressure from things like persistent load shedding. Never mind that. Now you also have to deal with, the very basic health needs of your livestock, of your animals, and that you have to now try and find other ways to ensure that you can continue protecting them to that extent. So it makes it all incredibly difficult, adds unnecessary costs and difficulties that shouldn't be there. So at some point, those costs are likely to be passed on to consumers because they have to deal with them somehow and factor them into their own business dealings, as it were, day to day. So don't be surprised if that factors into higher food prices down the line for certain food items. But luckily, and even by the time, we sort of report on this kind of thing, maybe the solutions are sort of grassroots solutions are being implemented because people just don't have a choice. They're trying to figure it out sort of as they go along, a sort of bottom up, as it were, versus top down, waiting for the state again and again to try and solve things. Maybe we're going to get another 5-year master plan from the Department of Agriculture or something that they'll say this will be fixed and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it's sad that all these sorts of issues come to this very basic level, but it indicates you've got the rhetoric of presidential summits and revolutionary statements and the state of the nation and jobs are being created and investment, bullet trains, all that sort of stuff. But then the government monopoly on animal vaccines can't even manufacture them.
Yeah, it just seems like a ridiculous bottleneck. Even if this, I would be against this state-owned enterprise, even if it did work properly. And of course, it's even worse when it doesn't work properly because you get exactly what we're experiencing now with, not only are farmers losing out on money here, but it's not great to have a whole bunch of animals dying of horrible diseases. Harry, what do you make of this story?
I think this just speaks to, the situation of South Africa. This is another example that feeds into that narrative that South Africa is on autopilot. I mean, we have a government, but every state-owned entity is, failing us. So now you have farmers, for example, buying, vaccines illegally and acquiring them through other means. Everybody, a boermakeplan, everybody's trying to, do their own thing.
Quite literally in this case.
Yeah. And, it's also very sad that on the one hand, it's very ironic because last year it was shown that South Africa is the most food secure country on the continent by far, and yet we don't have these simple vaccines anymore. That's killing around 50% of some farmers' livestock in one go. That's going to have huge ramifications. Like Chris said, also the costs that the farmers incur will then be transferred over to the consumer. And even though South Africa is a very food secure nation, many of our poor can't afford the food that is produced. I think Status A pegged it around 25% of households that don't have enough money to buy all the food that there is. And so with the food inflation that could come from this, I mean, that's just going to be disastrous for poor households. And then also, just one final point, this is a very terrible disease, apparently very painful for the animals that get them. So it's just a tragic government mistake, really.
So apparently part of the problem here is that you can't just buy these things on the international market because we have specific strains of the diseases that exist here that need to be sort of custom built for. But I suspect if you opened up the market a bit, you would not have that same problem. Gerbrandt talked about food security, but that seems to me like a low bar ultimately for where we want to be. You know, we want to be a dynamic agricultural powerhouse, particularly when it comes to, I don't know, livestock. We've got a lot of pasture in South Africa. You know, exporting our world-class meat to all sorts of countries across the world, not just secure in being able to feed ourselves. Chris, your final thoughts on this?
Maybe that's why the government is playing a long game with its foreign policy. So if it loses access to AGOA, for example, to those US markets, it doesn't need to worry about exporting food there. So it doesn't need to worry about the quality. I mean, we're all playing chess here while the ANC is playing checkers. Come on.
Madness. All right. Before we close up today, let's move on to our last story. And this is, I'm not quite sure what to make of this. And I suspect that more information will come out in the next few days, which may be interpreted by the technical experts to tell us what might have happened here. But the entire country of Botswana the other day, last night, just at around midnight, suffered a total blackout. That is, basically, they had the total grid collapse that we've been talking about on the show. Now, thankfully for them, it's not nearly as big of a deal. Things were able to be fired up much more quickly than they would be in South Africa. Their grid is, of course, tiny compared to ours. Their biggest towns are nothing compared to even sort of medium-sized towns in South Africa. So Botswana's power is reconnected once again. But the country does say that it is investigating what it called a grid disturbance, which saw its electricity grid fall over for a while. They've also had problems at some of their power plants that have created occasional load shedding in the country, despite its relatively low amount of electricity consumption. They sometimes export electricity to South Africa, but they also sometimes import electricity from South Africa. And it's important to note this because in the event of a South African grid collapse, one of the ways that you could get some electricity into the South African grid would be, in theory, to import it from other countries. Unfortunately, it looks like Botswana is not going to be able to supply us with any. And Mozambique and Zimbabwe are in a much worse state than even South Africa, so we probably shouldn't rely on them too much. Chris, any quick thoughts on this story?
Only that in the potential eventuality that we do experience a grid collapse, I hope either President Ramaphosa or Minister Ramaphosa appear on screen and say they've experienced a great disturbance in the grid, and that's how I will deal with this existential crisis of a grid collapse.
Kerry, any thoughts before we close up?
Just that I think it was the Energy Minister's 100th day in office, I think just last week or a few days ago. And
that's already, it flew by.
So,
probably because none of the clocks work because all the electricity's off.
Yeah, so just I don't think he's got much to show for it except touring the country, going to production facilities and having photos taken to be posted on social media. That's all.
Oh dear. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting. We will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a great afternoon and evening.